like countries like China, North Korea, Israel, Pakistan, and India. Iraq has been uncooperative with the UN world order and remains independent of Western control of its oil reserves, unlike Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. This is why she has been bombed steadily for 11 years by the U.S. and Britain. My guess is that in the not-too-distant future, so-called proof will be provided that Saddam Hussein was somehow partially responsible for the attack in the United States, and it will be irresistible then for the United States to retaliate against him. This will greatly and dangerously expand the war and provoke even greater hatred toward the United States, and it's all so unnecessary. It's just so hard for many Americans to understand how we inadvertently provoke the Arab Muslim people. And I'm not talking about the likes of bin Laden and his al-Qaeda gang. I'm talking about the Arab Muslim masses. In 1996, after 5 years of sanctions against Iraq and persistent bombing, CBS reporter Leslie Stahl asked our ambassador to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright, a simple question. We have heard that 500,000 children have died as a consequence of our policy against Iraq. Is the price worth it? Albright's response was, we think the price is worth it. Although this interview won an Emmy Award, it was rarely related in the U.S., but widely circulated in the Middle East. Some still wonder why America is despised in this region of the world. Former President George Bush had been criticized for not marching on to Baghdad at the end of the Persian Gulf War. He gave then, and stands by his explanation today, as a superb answer of why it was ill-advised to attempt to remove Saddam Hussein from power. There were strategic and tactical as well as humanitarian arguments against it. But the important and clinching argument against annihilating Baghdad was political. The coalition, in no uncertain terms, let it be known they wanted no part of it. Besides, the UN only authorized the removal of Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. The UN has never sanctioned the continued U.S. and British bombing of Iraq, a source of much hatred directed toward the United States. But placing of U.S. troops on what is seen as Muslim Holy Land in Saudi Arabia seems to have done exactly what the former president was trying to avoid, the breakup of the coalition. The coalition has hung together by a thread, but internal dissension among the secular and religious Arab Muslim nations within individual countries has intensified. Even today, the current crisis threatens the overthrow of every puppet pro-Western Arab leader from Egypt to Saudi Arabia to Kuwait. Many of the same advisors from the first Bush administration are now urging the current president to finish off Hussein. However, every reason given 11 years ago for not leveling Baghdad still holds true today, if not more so. It has been argued that we needed to maintain a presence in Saudi Arabia after the Persian Gulf War to protect the Saudi government from Iraqi attack. Others argue that it was only a cynical excuse to justify keeping troops to protect what our officials declared were our oil supplies. Some have even suggested that our expanded presence in Saudi Arabia was prompted by a need to keep King Fahd in power and to thwart any effort by Saudi fundamentalists from overthrowing his regime. Expanding the war by taking on Iraq at this time may please some allies, but it will lead to unbelievable chaos in the region and throughout the world. It will incite even more anti-American sentiment and expose us to even greater danger. It could prove to be an unmitigated disaster. Iran and Russia will not be pleased with this move, nor will our European allies. It is not our job to remove Saddam Hussein. That is the job of the Iraqi people. It is not our job to remove the Taliban. That is the business of the Afghan people. It is not our job to insist that the next government in Afghanistan include women, no matter how good of an idea it is. If this really is an issue, Why don't we insist that our friends in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait do the same thing as well as impose our will on them? Talk about hypocrisy. The mere thought that we fight wars for affirmative action in a country 6,000 miles from home with no cultural similarities should insult us all. Of course, it does distract from the issue of an oil pipeline through northern Afghanistan. We need to keep our eye on the target and not be so easily distracted. Assume for a minute that bin Laden is not in Afghanistan. Would any of our military effort in that region be justified? Since none of it would be related to American security, it would be difficult to justify it. Assume for a minute that bin Laden is as ill as I believe he is, with serious renal disease. Would he not do everything conceivable for his cause by provoking us into expanding the war and alienating as many Muslims as possible? Remember, to bin Laden, martyrdom is a noble calling, and he just may be more powerful in death than he is in life. An American invasion of Iraq would please bin Laden because it would rally his troops against any moderate Arab leader who appears to be supporting the United States. It would prove his point that America is up to no good, and oil and Arab infidels are the source of all the Muslims' problems. We have recently been reminded of Admiral Yamamoto's quote after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in expressing his fear that the event awakened a sleeping giant. Most everyone agrees with the prophetic wisdom of that comment. But I question the accuracy of drawing an analogy between the Pearl Harbor event and the World Trade Center attack. Hardly are we the same nation we were in 1941. Today, we're anything but a sleeping giant. There's no contest for our status as the world's only economic, political, and military superpower. A sleeping giant would not have troops in 141 countries throughout the world and be engaged in every conceivable conflict with 250,000 troops stationed abroad. The fear I have is that our policies, along with those of Britain, the UN, and NATO since World War II, inspired and have now awakened a long-forgotten sleeping giant, Islamic fundamentalism. Let's hope for all our sakes that Iraq is not made the target in this very complex war. The president, in the 2000 presidential campaign, argued against nation building, and he was right to do so. He also said, quote, "If we're an arrogant nation, they'll resent us," close quote. He wisely argued for humility and a policy that promotes peace. Attacking Baghdad or declaring war against Saddam Hussein or even continuing the illegal bombing of Iraq is hardly a policy of humility designed to promote peace. As we continue our bombing of Afghanistan, plans are made to install a new government sympathetic to the West and under UN control. These persuasive arguments, as always, is money. We were able to gain Pakistan's support, although it continually wavers in this manner. Appropriations are already being prepared in the Congress to rebuild all that we destroyed in Afghanistan and then some, even before the bombing has stopped. Rumsfeld's plan, as quoted and reported in Turkey's Hürriyet newspaper, lays out the plan for the next Iraqi government. Turkey's support is crucial, so the plan is to give Turkey oil from the northern Iraq Kirkuk field. The United States has also promised a pipeline running from Iraq through Turkey. How can the Turks resist such a generous offer? Since we subsidize Turkey and they bomb the Kurds while we punish the Iraqis for the same thing, this plan to divvy up wealth in the land of the Kurds is hardly a surprise. It seems that Washington never learns. Our foolish foreign interventions continually get us into more trouble than we have bargained for, and the spending is endless. I am not optimistic that this Congress will anytime soon come to its senses. I am afraid that we will never treat the taxpayers with respect. National bankruptcy is a more likely scenario than Congress adopting a frugal and wise spending policy. Mr. Speaker, we must make every effort to precisely define our target in this war and keep our eye on it. It is safe to assume that the number of people directly involved in the 9/11 attacks is closer to several hundred than the millions we are now talking about targeting with our planned shotgun approach to terrorism. One commentator pointed out that when the mafia commits violence, no one suggests we bomb Sicily. Today, it seems we are, in a symbolic way, not only bombing Sicily, but thinking about bombing Athens, Iraq. If a corrupt city or state government does business with a drug cartel or organized crime and violence results, we don't bomb City Hall or the state capitol. We limit the targets to those directly guilty and punish them. Could we not learn a lesson from these examples? It is difficult for everyone to put the 9/11 attacks in a proper perspective because any attempt to do so is construed as diminishing the utter horror of the events of that day. We must remember, though, that the 3,900 deaths incurred in the World Trade Center attacks are just slightly more than the deaths that occur on our nation's highway every month. Could it be that the sense of personal vulnerability we survivors feel motivates us in meting out justice rather than the concern for the victims of the attacks? Otherwise, the numbers don't add up to the proper response. If we lose sight of the target and unwisely broaden the war, the tragedy of 9/11 will pale in the death and destruction that could lie ahead. As members of Congress, we have a profound responsibility to mete out justice, provide security for our nation, and protect the liberties of all the people without senselessly expanding the war at the urging of narrow political and economic special interests. The price is too high and the danger too great. We must not lose our focus on the real target and inadvertently create new enemies for ourselves. Mr. Speaker, we have not done any better keeping our eye on the terrorist target on the home front than we have overseas. Not only has Congress come up short in picking the right target, it has directed all its energies in the wrong direction. The target of our efforts has sadly been the liberties of all Americans. With all the new power we have given to the administration, none has truly improved the chances of catching the terrorists who were responsible for the 9/11 attacks. All Americans will soon feel the consequences of this new legislation. Just as the crisis provided an opportunity for some to promote a special interest agenda in our foreign policy, many have seen the crisis as a chance to achieve changes in our domestic laws, which up until now were seen as dangerous and unfair to American citizens. Granting bailouts is not new for Congress, but current conditions have prompted many takers to line up for the handouts. There has always been a large constituency for expanding federal power for whatever reason, and these groups have been energized. The military-industrial complex is out in force and is optimistic. Union power is pleased with recent events and has not missed the opportunity to increase membership rolls. Federal policing powers, already in a bull market, received a super shot in the arm. The IRS, which detests financial privacy, gloats, while all the big spenders in Washington applaud the tools made available to crack down on tax dodgers. The drug warriors and anti-gun zealots love the new powers that now can be used to watch the every move of our citizens. Extremists who talk of the Constitution, promote right to life, form citizens' militia, or participate in non-mainstream religious practices now can be monitored much more effectively by those who find their views offensive. Laws recently passed by the Congress apply to all Americans, not just terrorists. But we should remember that if the terrorists are known and identified, existing laws would have been quite adequate to deal with them. Even before the passage of the recent draconian legislation, hundreds had already been arrested under suspicion, and millions of dollars of al-Qaeda funds had been frozen. None of these new laws will deal with uncooperative foreign entities like the Saudi government, which chose not to relinquish evidence pertaining to exactly who financed the terrorist operations. Unfortunately, the laws will affect all innocent Americans, yet will do nothing to thwart terrorism. The laws recently passed in Congress in response to the terrorist attacks can be compared to the efforts of anti-gun fanatics who jump at every chance to undermine the Second Amendment. When crimes are committed with the use of guns, it's argued that we must remove guns from society, or at least register them and make it difficult